Welcome, dear listeners, but take heed. Dangers await both within and without. Though this be a podcast, you must be warned. What Maleva's words will tell you about. Even a man who is pure in heart and says his prayers by night may become a wolf when the wolf's bane blooms and the autumn moon is bright.
Welcome to Sitting in the Dark, a podcast brought to you by True Story FM. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Ray Delancey. Joining me, as always, is the ever popular and handsome Tommy Metz III.
Rue to you. Oh, well, that's a bad start. Okay. I'm already off the rails.
And standing over there with the Queen doing the Werewolves of London is none other than Pete Wright himself. Pete Wright.
Elbow, elbow, wrist, wrist. I believe that's how it goes. Elbow, elbow, wrist, wrist. Hi, everybody.
Hi, friends.
How's it going, fellas?
Excellent.
Before we dive into this, I want to know from you guys, do you like werewolves? What's your experience with werewolf movies? You know, tell me about your history with werewolves, if you will.
You know, werewolves were never kind of at the top of the of the horror monster chain for me, and I don't know why. I think I have a guess, and that in horror, I thought the transformations for werewolves, like the effects of werewolves, were rough, and that was probably cemented in watching Jack Nicholson in Wolf. At the time when it came out, like Mike Nichols' Wolf, and I just really struggled with it. Although one of my favorite horror movies, which I kind of can't believe we're not talking about in this series, that I only just thought of right now, is Silver Bullet, which I always loved.
You know, that was originally on my list.
So
yeah, I had so many movies on my list that I had to cut, and that was one of them. And I apologize.
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, they're fine. Wolves are fine. And I've learned a lot in this series just through what you made us watch.
I am really glad that we're doing this because, as I've said, the old grump me, I'm not a classicist. And so I'm not a big monster fan, especially older monsters. But when I say I'm not a fan, it just means I haven't really given them a shot. Like I said at one point, these are not for me. Mummies are not scary. And so I just bounced. But then I'm remembering my favorite film of all time, the music video for Thriller, which I thought was outstanding. And I'm not joking, because if you remember, before he became a zombie, he became a werewolf. And that was really good transformation by George Landis. And so there is a part of my heart for werewolves in the same way that there is for a lot of these. I always have trouble getting used to the older movies, but when I meet them at their level, they're a lot of fun, and I'm really glad to do this. So thank you, Ray.
It's one of my favorite things about this podcast is being exposed to things that I hadn't been exposed to before. And I'm grateful to you guys for that. And I'm glad that I could be that in some capacity anyway here. So I grew up watching a lot of older movies taped off of TV at my grandmother's house. And one of my favorites, one that I had access to, was Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, which is the direct sequel to 1941's The Wolfman. Actually, they should have just kept Frankenstein out of that movie because that part was garbage. But anyway, I grew up with Lon Chaney Jr. as the werewolf. I always loved the monster movies, and when I was in high school, I absolutely loved The Howling and An American Werewolf in London in particular, because I thought that the makeup and the transformation scenes in those two movies in particular were just absolutely astounding. You know, as a teenager, those movies just, I thought there was nothing better. So let's go ahead and talk briefly about where werewolf lore mythology originated. There have been a few references in ancient Greek literature and folklore to men changing into wolves, but it really isn't until the Middle Ages that werewolves became more of a widespread superstition, especially in Europe. And even through early modern history, werewolfism or lycanthropy was a crime just like witchcraft was, and it was punishable by death. You know, in Europe, whenever there were witch hunts, they would also hunt people they suspected of being werewolves, and these people would be burned at the stake as well. A lot of brutal crimes, like crimes involving cannibalism and murder, ones that were particularly violent, would be blamed on werewolves. A lot of times, even people with rabies would be misattributed as having werewolfism.
Wow.
And the modern trope that werewolves are vulnerable to silver actually comes from 19th century German folklore, and likewise English lore of the time held that shapeshifters were vulnerable to silver. So that's where that particular bit of werewolf lore comes from.
The Germans were celebrating all of the shifting shapes, not just wolves. Right?
Yeah.
First I'm this, now I'm this. Now I'm over here. Do we know why silver? My apologies. There was something in one of the movies about how that the pure metal sucks out the bad. Was that correct?
That might have been just the movie. That,
I think that was
to be honest, so
Yeah.
many of these. Okay. Yeah. So many of these different tropes are changed
Yeah.
just for a specific movie, or altered in a certain way just for a specific movie or book or whatever. And so many of these tropes don't stay consistent. So it's really hard to say.
Well, like for example, across the slate of movies, there's like is it a curse? Well, it could be a curse if you're looking at the Wolfman, or the aptly titled The Curse of the Werewolf, but also it sometimes spreads like a disease, like an STD. And so like watching how, yeah, and sometimes it's like,
Sometimes
yeah,
it's just
hereditary. I was just going to
hereditary.
say it's like genetic, and they just get it.
Right. Yeah.
You know, it just
Yeah.
appears.
Well, the most fascinating thing to me is whenever you look at these films like on a timeline, it seems like over time that the superstitious elements are being weeded out. Whenever the first werewolf movies were made, the first two werewolf movies were silent films. Both of them are lost, but the first one in particular sounds really damn cool. It was from 1913. It was a movie just called The Werewolf, and it was about a Navajo woman who transforms into a wolf in order to carry out vengeance against the invading white settlers. And so there was a lot there that was not so much the werewolf lore that we know. It was more so like the movie Wolfen, where the Native American was able to use a wolf spirit to get back at those who had come onto their land. Another early but lost werewolf film is Wolf Blood from 1925, in which an injured man receives an emergency blood transfusion from a wolf.
Oh no.
Like there were no humans available apparently, so they used a wolf.
You do.
So then this guy is,
I mean, my dog
Yes, you
is my blood dog.
And
Like I
so-
just sometimes when I'm feeling down, I do a little impromptu transfusion.
I think I'm gonna start taking my dog with me with like a little bracelet that says, "In case of emergency,
Right.
just use this dog."
Right.
And then after he has the transfusion, he's just plagued by dreams of being a wolf. And the movie itself is not so much a horror movie as a fantasy. And I'm told that it was kind of boring by all accounts, but it's lost, so I can't really say for myself. But the first werewolf film that we have access to is the 1935 film Werewolf of London, which was made by Universal. And it was the first film to portray an anthropomorphic werewolf as opposed to just a wolf, a regular animal wolf, quadruped. And that movie established the canon that the werewolf always kills what he loves the most. The thing with that movie, though, is that it didn't do so great at the box office. It wasn't popular, and so they just didn't do anything with werewolves for a while after that. At the beginning of werewolf cinema history, so to speak, there's so much more mysticism and ridiculousness and just so much more superstitions around these things. And people, generally speaking, at the time in the 20s and 30s, were much more susceptible to superstition and myth, you know? And over time, it's amazing to me how much that has been weeded out of werewolf movies, to the point where you hear them in movies say like, oh, you just hear about that in movies. Like, oh, I thought you had to kill that with a silver bullet. Nah, that's just in the movies. And then like ginger snaps, for example, you can kill a werewolf by any means. You can hit one with a car. When animals dream, like you guys were mentioning, it just comes down to a family ailment that is being passed down genetically from person to person. So that's evolution. That's science. That's not
the werewolf podcast.
Well, it is interesting though. It sort of becomes, and I'm not trying to be, but like instead of a god of the gaps, like a wolf of the gaps. Like as we are less scared of this being real, we start to involve it in make it a metaphor.
Yeah.
Instead of there's really things out in the woods that are going to eat us because we have flashlights now. And so instead it's about puberty and sexual awakening. Which is the way that these things should go. So I like
sexual awakening, and when animals dream, like the curse of legacy, right? Like the struggles of family and the baggage that we carry. And what's interesting about that, you said something interesting. I was complaining to Tom last night about when animals dream specifically because you said the werewolf always kills what it loves the most. And I think that's why the end of When Werewolves Dream strikes me as so off kilter, or when animals dream is off kilter, because she doesn't. And I wanted her to do it. I wanted her to kill him and be alone and celebrate. And Tom was like, "No, I like happy endings in wolf movies."
I wanted one. I like the idea of going through this change, and especially if it's a hereditary change, still being able to find love. That was the only movie that sort of reversed the curse in a way that everybody, well, a lot of people didn't end up happy. But after the entire town was killed, 2 people got to get on a hairy boat and
and I use that as an example of look at what these more modern movies are doing to shake off the shackles of past lore, because that's an example of the werewolf not killing what it loves the most, right? Like I think that's an interesting example.
And I think that's another great example too of showing how society, the people who are watching the movies, have progressed. You know, whereas before, something like a personal problem like this wouldn't have been something that you talked about with people. This would have been something you kept to yourself, something that you tried to fix by yourself, or you know what I mean? It wasn't really, you know how like there's that toxic attitude where, oh, if you're a man, you can't talk about your problems or whatever, you know, like suck it up and be a man kind of thing. But here in the newer movies, you see, like, particularly in When Animals Dream, you know, I think it's kind of cool that here we have this character who has found a kindred spirit, somebody who, though he's not a wolf, loves her for who she is, and, you know, is trying to help her through it instead of her trying to get through it by herself. Does that make any sense?
Instead of being shunned in the earlier movies, both the Wolfman and Curse of the Werewolf have very Frankenstein-y moments where it's pitchforks in the entire town being like, get out of here, get out of here. It's later with the more modern movies where it's community comes together. Like there are people, there's like a Scooby gang trying to help the girl in Ginger Snaps. When Animals Dream, what's her name? Fish Factory Magoo gets a boyfriend, that kind of thing. It's a way of looking past the just let's destroy the other and run them out of town, which is neat. That's
Jack
a cool
Nicholson
evolution.
was literally stabbed with a pitchfork at one point, although it was by another werewolf. So what do you
Who made a better werewolf, Jack Nicholson or James Spader?
James Spader, always James Spader. I think James Spader is a werewolf right now.
In real life.
Let's go back and talk about a little bit of these movies specifically. The Wolfman, 1941. I know, Tommy, in particular, you haven't been into the old movies as much. What did you think of this one?
I thought it was, well, first of all, I thought it was really interesting to go back to an earlier episode. It literally just begins with the Book of the Vampire.
Yes.
Just text on screen. Here's what lycanthropy, we never know, is. It's all caught up. Let's go. Let's get wolfy, which I thought was kind of fun. I found it very charming and neat. I liked the aesthetic of it. I thought it was a pretty cool way to start things. Obviously, there's a good amount of depicting the Romani people in the way that they do doesn't the what you would call gypsies, but the Roma people, doesn't hold up great. But it's still, for all of that, I thought it looked really good. My favorite part of the movie, if I could just skip ahead, is when the Wolfman kills the gravedigger and howls. And the townspeople are like, "Did you hear that? There's no time to waste. Quick, put on your full suits and ties and let's go search." Everyone has to be like, "There's no time for an ascot. Just give me my bow tie." And they all run out, and they're the best dressed, like, storm the castle townspeople in the entire world. I thought that was incredible. But I like the setup of the good and evil in every man's soul. In this case, it's the evil that takes the form of an animal. That's one of the quotes from it, that it's that idea also, these monsters, kind of like a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde, that the monster in this one can be in us. It's just waiting to be unleashed.
Right.
And sometimes it can be because of an animal or something, but it's like, it's there. We're all animals at some point, and sometimes it just becomes a lot hairier.
Yeah, no, I'm with Tom. It was fun seeing Bela Lugosi, Claude Rains, like the whole crew. It sometimes when I watch these movies, especially maybe for this show, it feels like I'm going to a museum and I'm watching a museum exhibit a little bit, like going back in time. This movie, unlike some of the early Lovecraft films that we watched, like this movie was one that I felt like I was watching like in a diorama, because it was quaint more than some of the others, and it was hard to get lost. And I think I was feeling some of the reason I didn't really get into wolf movies early in life, because I was feeling some of that sort of camp around the character, the monster of the Wolfman, which is a little ridiculous for me. But I really like the story. I like the idea of the family ancestry going home, and there's always some sort of family secret, twisted family secret, and I think it plays well here. So I really enjoyed it. It's fun to see Maria Uspenskaya in here as our Romani sorceress, right? That was a neat addition, and I couldn't help but think, like, what is she thinking right now as she's making this movie in particular? Like, what is going on in her head, given the other stuff that she's done? So I really I thought it was good. I enjoyed my time with the Wolfman, and I think it was a nice entry to our series.
I wonder what Maria Uspenskaya would think if she knew this was the role she'd be remembered for.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Right. So.
Yeah, this is the movie that made Werewolves popular. This movie was just phenomenally received, and Tommy mentioned the townspeople needing to get dressed. Apparently, the werewolf also does, because in the first transformation scene, he's wearing a white undershirt as he transforms, and then cut to you see him in the woods, and he must have taken the time after he transformed to put on his button-down shirt over
the reverse Hulk.
He
gets more and more dressed.
Well, and that's a really good point, though, about those transformations. Like, I thought it was really interesting the way the Wolfman, I guess what I expected in the Wolfman was every time we saw the wolf, we'd get the dissolve transformations, and we did. That was really like saved for the bitter end of the movie. And I was curious about that. Like, why did they hold back? That it's an interesting use of restraint on this particular sort of ultimately editing choice.
Well, and I found out that initially this movie was actually going to be really different from what we eventually got. Initially, it was going to be that we never really saw the Wolfman until like the very end, and we only saw him as Larry's reflection. And the whole time we're supposed to be wondering, is this really happening to him, or is it only in his mind? Kind of like a mystery. Is he actually turning into a werewolf? Because we don't see any of the werewolf's hijinks on screen. We just hear about it after the fact. And they ended up changing this because, they wanted to see the monster. They wanted something, that would, draw people in and stuff like that. But actually, that's one of the reasons why the first werewolf in the movie, played by Bela Lugosi, appears as an actual wolf or as a dog. He's actually played by a police dog named Moose.
No, good boy.
What an identity crisis.
Because I guess the dog that they had on set just wasn't working out, and the police dog kind of knew what to do, and actually Lon Chaney Jr. adopted him after they made this movie.
Oh man, that's awesome.
That's one of the reasons why Bela Lugosi is shown as a wolf and Lon Chaney Jr. is shown as a bipedal werewolf on two legs, because it was initially supposed to be more so in his head, which I found interesting, because I always wondered why the difference between those two. That never made sense to me, but I enjoy the movie. As a matter of fact, if there was any movie prop that I could own, it would be the wolf head cane from this movie.
Oh, sure.
I would love to own
that. Was
that
not
prop.
small. Like, you don't have to worry about like losing your grip. Like, that was a significant artifact.
One interesting thing that I want to note about this movie is that it also is the first instance that I saw of using the pentagram with a werewolf in werewolf lore, because you don't really see the werewolf associated with biblical things that often. You do sometimes, but it's really not that common. It's more European mythology, folklore type stuff than it is, biblical. I don't recall reading anything about werewolves in the Bible, but Then one last thing that I just want to mention about this movie before we move on is the fact that at the end, the werewolf is killed by his father, someone who loves him. And I am mad at myself because as I was watching it the last time, I noticed something for the first time, and that was that the shot of Claude Rains as Sir John beating the werewolf to death with the cane is a mirror shot of Lon Chaney Jr. beating the other werewolf with the cane. It's like framed the exact same way, but each one is mirrored.
Right.
Yeah. And I thought that was really cool. And I'm so mad at myself that I never noticed that before my most recent viewing. Moving on, there were plenty of werewolf movies in between here, but we're going to move on to The Curse of the Werewolf, 1961 from Hammer. Tommy really liked the pipe that the guy smoked in this movie.
My pipe's
And who can
ridiculous.
blame him?
It was like an entire scrimshaw. It was an entire skeleton of a whale that he was smoking out of.
It was crazy.
I grew up or have lived my life thinking that Hammer meant, I know that Hammer meant cheap for some reason.
Sure.
This movie looked awesome.
Yeah.
I thought this movie had, for its time, had a surprisingly good production value. I kept waiting for the sets to fall over, or there'll be just the same person in one costume. But then the dinner scene, there's so many people in it and it's really covered and it really takes its time. And I believed that was sort of not really believed it, but there were bells ringing when the beggar shows up. I was really taken back. I was waiting for this to be a cheapie, and instead I was impressed.
Yeah, I think, Ray, talk about that a little bit, because I'm not a huge, I'm exactly with Tom on Hammer films. Is this is this what we should have always expected from Hammer film productions?
Actually, this is one of the better Hammer films, in my opinion.
Okay.
As far as production goes and things like that. And it was earlier on in their run too, so they weren't as worried about saving money as they were later down the road.
It's a long time before there is even a wolf involved. This movie just goes and goes. They're like, wait, it's called Curse of the Werewolf? Oh no, I thought it was called Beggar Time.
This is my question about this one, just in terms of the story, right? Because the beggar comes, He's begging, he's taunted by the evil royals and thrown into the dungeon for 15 years, something like that. And then he goes crazy because of his long confinement. He sort of turns into a werewolf just by not cutting his hair. And then he rapes the beautiful daughter when they throw her in there. And so was it because the beggar was the werewolf all along?
Well, I think it is explained when we have little boy werewolf and Harry Palms, and he's like, I'm not hungry because I'm filled with kittens. That someone says maybe a wandering spirit of an animal got into the boy at the moment of death because he was a weak soul. That is just thrown in there as if the hairy man wasn't a werewolf, that there was just a spirit of werewolf around and then jumped in just at the right time, almost like a possession kind of a thing.
I kind of got that vibe, but I couldn't tell if it was. It almost feels like they're hand waving a bit too much when maybe they already had sort of the manifestation of insanity and genetics to create the werewolf. Maybe I don't understand why they needed to shoehorn that line in.
The whole story behind how the werewolf came to be on this, I don't know how they came to write it this way, but have you guys seen The Omen?
Long time ago. It's all for you, Damien.
So this guy basically has the same origin story as Damien. He was born of a woman who was raped by a madman. The baby is unwanted and was born on Christmas Day. And so it's considered to be unholy and unwanted. And so this is one of those rare instances where lycanthropy is loosely associated with satanic things.
Apart from the Christmas Day, just as a side note, that's also Freddy Krueger's backstory.
Mm-hmm.
His mom was imprisoned and raped by a whole bunch of creeps, and then he showed up. Yeah. Sorry, I like things. So you were saying a connection to Satan.
Right. And this movie is unique in that regard because, like I said, relating werewolfism to Satanism and those things is not that common. It's not uncommon, but it's not that common. And to make that the impetus for how we get the werewolf in this movie, I think speaks a lot to the audience of the time, because I think that, this was an audience who was very, very Christian. This was a UK movie. So in 1961. So I'm sure you had a very heavily religiously influenced audience at the time who really ate this stuff up. There's really not much more that I have to say on this movie other than the werewolf design is very interesting. This is the only time that I have ever seen the main werewolf be like white haired, and he's a very unique looking monster. He looks slightly similar to the one that we see in Universal's Werewolf of London from 1935, but he's much more hulkier. He's hulkier, he's hairier, and there's more blood. This one can be killed by a silver bullet.
The Wolfman, if we sort of agreed that the Wolfman was a bit about the power of mind over body, one of the slight transformations, no pun intended, for Curse of the Werewolf is the quote, here is it, a werewolf is a body where the soul and the spirit are constantly at war. So it's less body and mind and more internal rumblings. Your spirit and your soul, it doesn't bother explaining the difference between those two. But again, it's still everything is inside of you trying to get out. And what comes out is, that's sort of what you're fighting against, which is interesting. And this was the first one, I think, out of the first one, this is the Book of the Vampire, and this is the priest. And he says the only cure is love.
Okay, yeah. So
the only cure for lycanthropy is love. And this is at 43 minutes in, I wrote, still no glimpse of a werewolf. Yeah.
or even the main actor for that reason. This movie spent a lot of time on the
It
backstory.
really did. Yeah. This kind of felt like two movies that they put together.
Next, 1981 was
What happened in
a huge year for
1981?
werewolf movies because there were 3 great movies. People were on a lot of coke.
I feel like a wolf.
We had 3 werewolf movies that we're just gonna touch on these briefly because there's not a whole lot as far as lore or what have you that we can touch on here. But An American Werewolf in London, The Howling, and Wolfen were all 3 werewolf movies that came out this year. And I wasn't even alive in this year, but I wish that I was, because that would have been a great year to be going to the movies to see werewolves. The Howling was the first one to be released. The Howling, like I mentioned earlier, was a favorite of mine growing up, mostly because I thought that the transformation scene was absolutely phenomenal. The transformation scene was actually originally being done by Rick Baker, but he bowed out to go do An American Werewolf in London. And so Rob Bottin, of the Thing fame, came in and did the transformation makeup for all this. And it was crazy because they used exploding condoms filled with blood underneath the skin to make it look like his skin was like bubbling and expanding. And
God.
this movie and American Werewolf in London in particular do something interesting. They both pay homage to the werewolf movies of the past, while also, I think, trying to distance themselves a little bit from some of that. They try to distance themselves a little bit from some of the more mystical stuff, especially American Werewolf in London. American Werewolf in London, for my money, by the way, has the best looking werewolf. I absolutely love the look of the werewolf in that movie.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of which, do you guys have a favorite werewolf from a movie?
I don't. I mean, I think it's probably American Werewolf in London. I think that's going to be the one.
Yeah.
Although, I think they did some really interesting creature design work in it's another vampire wolf
Van
thing
Helsing.
with sexy leather.
The Underworld.
Oh, Underworld.
Like the wolves in Underworld.
Yeah, they are. That's an interesting movie, to explore, werewolf lore, because that movie does some interesting and unique things.
Yeah, and they're also sweaty. The lichens. It's the rise of the lichens. But they're just also sweaty. It's like sweaty wolves.
Wolfen is one that I included on this list because I thought that it really intrigued me. I really liked that it kind of goes back to that 1913 movie, the Werewolf, with the Navajo woman who's getting revenge on the white people who are invading her land, because that's essentially what we have here. I found it interesting that here in this movie, the werewolf is explained as being a wolf spirit that can be accessed by these people and used to hunt, or in this case, to take out people that are causing their people harm.
And this has a neat connection to Curse of the Werewolf. Brian is in the chat, and he brought up the idea, even though we talked about the idea of that the werewolf we don't think comes from the guy in the prison necessarily, but that he is treated so horribly that this whole lore starts with cruelty, with class differences, with certain people being shunned. He's thrown in prison and forgotten about. So he's just overlooked by history. And then go to Wolfen, and it's about potentially, Native Americans being hunted out of existence, being pushed away, that their hunting grounds is being overdeveloped, almost just like a comment on American colonialism. So it's also about that, of like that the wolves, that it's the problem of either the rich people or advancement or development is causing the problems in the beginning that then lead to monstrous changes in people.
Yeah,
which is
for sure. Really interesting. And I think that connection is great. The movie itself practically is, I mean, it's a neat variation because it's a detective film, right? Like it's a story about like solving crime. And so I think that the conflict of throwing in this sort of monster element or this supernatural element with Albert Finney, who is doing great work. I really enjoyed watching him in this movie. I think that and Gregory Hines. I mean, come on, Gregory Hines, fantastic lab tech. So I think all of that works really well. The challenge with the movie, I think, comes back into some of the supernatural. Like, I think that is the pacing is impacted pretty powerfully in this movie. It goes from being really great and really interesting to super dog slow.
Right.
And it's I really struggled with that. I think some of the special effects and the social commentary right on the mark. The performances awesome, narratively uneven, and kind of less fun than I expected it to be.
Yep.
It seems to me, and this is kind of a general statement about film and TV in general, but it seems to me like this kind of story with Native American peoples being, taken out of their land and white people being held accountable was the kind of story that was becoming popular at this time, because I just remember seeing a lot of it in movies and TV at the time.
I think almost as kind of the representation of the Native American character is doing the work of his life. I think him running around the city naked is amazing. Looks good, almost tight, and I think he's an interesting sort of avatar for what we're talking about, and also happens to represent when the movie starts to slow down, right? It's like part of it, maybe it's because of the title, and because 1981 was such a year for werewolf movies. When we don't get a werewolf in this movie, it's a little disappointing.
Yeah, it seems like they're cashing in a little bit, maybe.
Yeah, it is.
Right. Well, I just want to shout out back to the Howling that it was really nice to revisit Dee Wallace, who we've interviewed a couple of times on various podcasts. She's delightful, and her scream in this movie is the stuff of legends.
Then the last two movies we have are a little similar. Ginger Snaps from 2000 and When Animals Dream from 2014, both with female protagonists for a change, and both dealing with more body related things as opposed to having been attacked by somebody. I mean, Ginger was attacked, but the focus is not so much on her attack as it is the transformation. Because one thing that I find absolutely intriguing about Ginger Snaps is the fact that she gets attacked by this werewolf, and her transformation takes a month. She gradually changes over a month. I have no idea what that's supposed to be symbolic of or anything.
Well, yeah, and I mean, you want to talk about the slow transformation, and we can also talk about When Animals Dream, right? It's sort of the same thing as we're watching somebody grow into a new part of themselves, and it's very much linked to the lunar cycle, the menstruation cycle in Ginger Snaps, and the same sort of sexual awakening in When Animals Dream, and I thought they were fascinating. Of the set of movies, I definitely like them for different reasons than I would like the others, but I like them the most.
Definitely
of the set.
Definitely, I'm right there with you. Ginger Snaps, with the exception of American Werewolf, is my favorite werewolf movie, and I don't know precisely what it is. I love the writing. I love and I feel like we've already talked about it, but I just love the way that they use the female menstrual cycle as that analogy for the werewolfism. When Animals Dream, I think, is like, we started all the way back here with all this mysticism, like I said, and then here we are in 2014, and we have this werewolf movie where this girl is just born with this condition. She's born with this condition. She's is in this town where she has no friends. She's stuck at home with her parents. She seemingly has no life other than going to work and taking care of her ailing mother. And all of a sudden, now she's put upon by this inherited disease, and she's dealing with that. Tommy, what did you think of When Animals Dream?
I largely loved it. I loved the atmosphere of it. I loved how the violence was offset by that real Scandinavian, like empty frames, nothing's going on thing. It had my favorite. Oh no, Ginger Snaps. I want to talk about both real quick. Ginger Snaps had my favorite world building moment where it opens with the death of Baxter, a dog, in this horrible moment where it does like this, and she goes, "They got Baxter," and all these kids in the street look over and then immediately start playing again. Street hockey, meaning this town is over it. Like, it put us in a thing where this has been going on for a while. There's so many dogs being killed and stuff that everyone just knows something's going on. In addition to the let's see, there's two things I wanted to say. In addition to the body changing, these films are also very much about feminism. I don't know if, like, feminist werewolf genre, if that's a thing, but this makes a play for it, because in addition to them changing, growing up, changing maybe their sexual appetite, growing, all of that thing, they are then treated as monsters. And American or any society has a terrible history, of course, of doing that, of having townspeople saying, "You're gross." Let's see. Maybe so you're doing drugs with guys. Something is definitely wrong with you. Like, they were put on this pedestal, and then, like Carrie, just because of their natural development, we try to keep them like they were pre-transformation, and that's just not a possibility. I also like that both Ginger Snaps and When Animals Dream, they're both curses, but in a very different way. They call the menstrual cycle a curse. And I think the mom says, "Oh, it's just the curse," or something like that. So the curse being that you are going to grow up, even if society doesn't want you to, you are going to change. And then When Animals Dream, the curse is hereditary. Right. Sometimes if you have sick parents, it will be passed down to you. So the idea of a curse, really, to go back to what Ray started with, which I loved so much, of the curse being all mysticism and superstition and otherworldly supernatural things, and then just using that as there's curses in everyday life. We don't need that. So let's use a metaphor to push it, to make it more watchable, because no one wants to just necessarily sit around and talk about periods for 2 hours. But instead, if it's like a werewolf involved, then we can give voice and images to these everyday things that can be very painful, these kind of transformations.
I think the other side of that, too, the note you made about the community being over it, I think both of these movies deal with the public reaction to all of the things that these characters are going through in a really interesting way. Obviously in Ginger Snaps, they're scared of it because the dogs, all their dogs are being taken, right? But they all know it's going to happen, and it's a horrifying thing, right? The dogs become this sort of symbol for how terrified everybody is to talk about real life changes as a barometer for the community as it changes and grows. And then we go to When Animals Dream, and the community they clearly know about the family. They know about these changes that happen to the family, and nobody talks about it, right? It is completely shut down when it's obvious to everyone, not just that it's happening. Unlike in Ginger Snaps, the dogs are happening. They also know why. They know that the mother is responsible to it. They know how to see when the mother is making changes, check her fingernails, check her gums, right? All of those signals are sent as a function of the community trying to hide from reality. And I think that is such a fascinating bit of commentary on this. The other thing that sets these movies apart, just sort of subjectively, is monster design, right? In Ginger Snaps, it's a horrifying, kind of more along the lines of the sweaty kind of monster dog. And definitely they didn't, they made choices with what looks to be possibly limited creature budget, and made the creature that they had. And we have the much more sort of, I don't know, elegant, fur design of When Animals Dream, which I thought was really exceptional. We also had more, looks like CGI hints insinuating themselves in the when animals dream, when her back is, when she's like writhing and her back is going, and you see the rippling down her spine of the fur as it comes out. Most of the stuff with her is just makeup, but some of those effect sequences I think were incredibly effective in When Animals Dream.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely. Wrapping up then, this is just an extremely interesting subgenre of horror to me. Even though the tropes are never really consistent and the reasoning behind the mythology and the lore changes over time, the one thing that doesn't is that this is about the duality of mankind.
Mm-hmm.
This is about the evil inside. This is about love versus evil. And because it's not so tied down to any kind of specific occult or Satanism or anything like that, I think that it can be used as, as an allegory for all these other everyday things, like in Ginger Snaps and When Animals Dream. And, it will be so easy to make werewolf movies for a very long time for that reason.
It's interesting to me, Ray, because you watch a lot of these classic films. Where does the werewolf rank in the classic monster lore? Because we get the same sort of duality of man in Jekyll and Hyde. There's the internal sort of transformation, coming of age, puberty, sexuality in vampire movies, right? We've this one, it almost seems like part of the reason it is so free to play with the tropes is that maybe it wasn't as sort of solidified when they started making movies about it than, say, vampire lore. Is it that they didn't have as good of a book of the vampire for wolves that they could do whatever they want?
They weren't shackled by everything. Sure, that's an interesting point. I like that.
And another thing is, whereas, say, Dracula was
right,
based on a novel, none of this really wasn't. People are really each screenwriter is making this up as they go along, unless it's based off of, another fictional work down the line, like Wolf.
You're saying the original Werewolf wasn't an executive at a publishing house? Weird.
Well,
so weird.
That's an outstanding point. And as Brian just put in the chat, how the transformations work and how werewolfism, for lack of a better word, is passed on and the rules involved change.
Yeah.
They're pretty inconsistent. And that could seem random, but I like the word freeing. I like that it is an object, kind of a blunt object that you can then morph to tell whatever kind of story that you want to tell. That's interesting. I like
I think 1981 is a great example of that, right? Because here we have a year where everybody thought, let's make something different. We're going to take our own, we're going to make, werewolves and wolves a platform for just play and try something different in each of these movies. And also then in some cases do a lot of coke and see what happens next. And so, I think that's really, really interesting. And it's not just in 81. Obviously Silver Bullet comes around in 1985. Like some of the big movies in the 80s, the big werewolf movies are really pushing in interesting directions about what they can do with the lore. I think it's fascinating. I'm really glad we did this particular series. And honestly, we did so many across so many years, but there are enough that I feel like we missed. I definitely want to go back and revisit some of these movies, watch some other ones. For now, today, I'm a little bit werewolfed out.
Happily werewolfed out.
Enthusiastically.
Yes, I have shaved down my teeth. I have taped down my tail.
that was a Ginger Snap that was so good. They have tails that are slowly growing, and I thought that was amazing. What a great bit. What a great bit. Tape the tail. You got to tape the tail.
All right. Thank you so much for joining me on this, guys. This was a really fun conversation to have.
Thank you, Ray. This was great. And I would not, because I'm me, I know I would not have seen these movies had you not suggested them, and I am all the better for it. So thank you.
We do have to talk about what's coming next, and it's not me.
It's me! And I'm going to talk like this the whole time!
Oh, good.
Yes, I do not have a name for it yet, and I do not have all of the movies yet. We will be going deep, not wide, and what I would like to discuss is the evolution of the epistolary tradition found in books like Dracula, Frankenstein, how this whole book's made up of that the form is the function. It's notes,
Okay.
it's charts, it's diary entries, and how that has changed in the modern film era with things like found footage and the relatively new genre that is called screenlight, with movies like
Yes.
Unfriended, things like that. That we are actually going to be taking movies where the form is the point and how it changes you and your relationship to the people, to the characters, how it can really make fear change in a different way. And so that is
What a fascinating subject area,
Oh,
Tom.
good.
I'll say.
I'm going to make you watch 3 to 4 films.
Yeah.
There's a lot of options, but I'm going
Thank
to
you.
narrow it down. But number one, with a bullet to start it off, of course, because we're not doing a history of found footage, but we will almost certainly start with Blair Witch.
Okay.
And start
Okay.
there. And that's it. So we will be doing that someday in the future. And I look forward to
Me
us all
too.
doing that.
I am waiting with bated breath.
Oh, good.
This has been really fun. Ray, thank you so much for your tutelage and tour through the
Thank you, Ray.
through the litter. We'll call it the litter
Thank you.
of werewolf movies. Is that fair? Is that too gross? Anyway, this has been super fun. Thank you, everybody, for hanging out and
That's the Howling
and
3.
downloading and listening to this show. We sure appreciate you doing that. Don't forget to do all the stuff you do with podcasts. We're still a pretty new show, and if you want to share the show and tell a friend, phone a friend, and tell them about the werewolves or all the other stuff we're doing on Sitting in the Dark, we sure appreciate it. Don't forget, if you'd like longer ad-free episodes of the show, visit thenextreel.com/membership and subscribe. For a few bucks a month, you'll have access to the beefier show, plus the triple secret Discord channels on the True Story FM server. We would love to have you there. On behalf of our teacher this week, Ray Delancey, and the most handsomest ever in the world, Tommy, that handsome Metz the Third, I'm Pete Wright. We'll catch you
How
next
rude.
month right here on Sitting in the Dark.